So today we are going to take a look at Pandemic by Slavoj Zizek. Um, his name's kind of hard to pronounce. His background is he relies a lot on Marx, Hegel, and Lacan, and Freud to a lesser extent, to make his arguments. And so his background kind of informs a lot. As far as accessibility goes, relative to another of his books that I've read, like A Thief in Broad Daylight, this book seems more accessible and less reliant on heavy theory. And as you might have guessed, it's related to the pandemic. I think the cover's a little funny. Uh, when I look at it, it makes me think Pandemic at the Disco, but obviously a very serious topic. Uh, the way he has a few ideas that are informed by a lot of his theory. One thing I'd like to say critically of the book before we get started is it seemed quite a bit rushed and very short, but I think he wanted to get the subject material out as quickly as possible, and so that to some extent that can explain why it was like that. He makes arguments that there are some political organizational effects of the pandemic or that the pandemic reveals. The first is namely that we're all in kind of the same boat uh, to some extent moving forward, um, and that solutions have to be global because problems spill over in a global way. And some of the that all of this is so global is kind of a consequence of the progression of humanity, right? You have all these planes and everything just spreads. Just the interconnectedness of humanity at this point means that, and that we can all transmit it. An infectious disease like this means that, to some extent, any country's problems, insofar as they relate to infectious disease, are all countries' problems. And so, one of the Zizek is interested in communism as a form of government, and one of the commentaries he makes is that he thinks that the pandemic, some of the interventions that the pandemic necessitates are communistic in nature, and he draws attention to that, like the I forget the name of the protocol, but when the government seizes some of the factories for the purpose of repurposing them to make PPE equipment, how that is obviously the government seizing the means of production. It's communism, right? But no one finds it especially problematic in a time of panic. And that raises some interesting implications for capitalistic societies. For those who like capitalism, it can look like a slippery slope. Zizek welcomes it, um, which and I think it's this narrative of the suspension of the normal. We're in a time of extenuating circumstances, and often there's like this. People become very okay with the suspension of the normal means of things. Um, but Zizek hopes that it's a way moving forward. So one of the things he talks about is how, in some ways, the Chinese communist government is better equipped to deal with the pandemic because of the top-down control that it has over its population. I remember seeing stuff in the news about how if someone was infected with the coronavirus, they just arrested them and forced quarantined them, which obviously that's a more effective way at stopping the spread, right? You're interfering with personal liberties, but the, it's hard to question the efficacy in some regards. Um, and so that was interesting. Uh, but one thing he criticizes the Chinese government on is that the lack of, in order to be able to properly address a pandemic, you need to have trust between your people and the government, so that the people listen to the government. And he suggests that that's not true in China. and that's one area where Western governments have more of an advantage, although the trust isn't tremendously high in the West either. Um, and the needs for the intervention of the state, or the coronavirus highlights needs uh, for certain circumstances that require state intervention, according to Zizek. And I think he's correct. I think that's kind of why you have central governments, is to deal with big natural disasters and to regulate corporations, and that's the primary reason they're there. And so if you can coordinate efforts, but one of the problems is efforts need to be coordinated globally, and it doesn't seem like there's a very good way to do that. And Zizek doesn't offer necessarily a solution, just says that it needs to be done to some degree. Um, I thought this. Well, let's get into the ratings. So for utility, I gave it a 4. I thought that some of his points he made were interesting. The book's very short and fairly easy to get through. It's a little theoretical, but I don't think the material's too tremendously useful. Perhaps interesting and useful for thinking about the pandemic. I think it's very topical, and that moving forward, maybe this book isn't. If you wanted to read some of Zizek, might not be the book to get. I like his writing style. I like a lot of the points he makes regarding things, because they're not the types of points I normally see, but I think that there is something to them. But I find myself disagreeing with a lot of what Zizek says in a lot of spaces. So we'll see. For entertainment, I gave it a 7. His writing is generally pretty interesting from what I've been able to read myself. For interesting, I gave it a 7.5. I like some of the points he makes. I think that they're definitely topical and relevant. Perhaps the book gets less interesting the farther away you get from the pandemic, but we're still in it. In fact, we're now in the United States, where everything's spiking right now, and simultaneously there's a vaccine. We are probably in the worst of it, or going to be in the worst of it in about 2 to 3 weeks, something along those lines. For novelty, I gave it a 5.5. I thought that some of the points he made are interesting, but I'm not sure if you're tremendously worse off if you never encountered them, and so I didn't give an especially high score. For style, I gave a 6. There were perhaps I should have scored this a little bit higher. I didn't enjoy this as much as I did his previous book that I read. In some sense, I feel that it was a little rushed, and even his other book seemed a little rushed, and so okay. Readability, I gave it a 6. It's quite a bit easier to read than his other book. He invokes less Lacan and Freud and Hegel and types of theories that require, I think, more moving parts to understand what he's saying, and so it's easier to understand. For difficulty, I give it a 4. It's still fairly difficult. Overall rating of 5.71. I'm not sure I'm going to recommend this book too often. I think it was fairly interesting, but I'm not sure what circumstances I would recommend it in, uh, because I think it's a very topical book, and I think that it was more topical when it was published I think it was published like 4 to 6 months ago, and now the nature of some of his critiques no longer seems applicable, because well, he's talking about the need for a response and like how this might change things. And at least in the United States, the trend has been towards apathy or frustration, and people are tired of staying indoors and that sort of thing. Um, and so I think he might have missed the mark. But if you liked this review, feel free to give it a like or to subscribe. And as far as discussion goes, what do you think of government's role in regulating the pandemics? And then further, on like another layer, uh, is there for there to be like global international coordination? What type of prescriptions would be necessary, and like should the WHO be expanded? That sort of thing are interesting questions because if if another country has a problem with a pandemic moving forward, it's very clear that it becomes everyone's problem really quickly, right? It wasn't just China that had a problem last December. We all had a problem last December, right? And it's the way technology works and global, the just the way everything's connected now makes it impossible to completely stop the spread of something like this. And so it seems to have hit Western society harder, which might be have to do with cultural differences regarding mask wearing. I'm not entirely sure as to all the causes. I'm sure you could draw up a whole bunch of. You could do a statistical analysis with a bunch of factors and say it could be a bunch of things. It's all correlative. But to what extent might an international organization of some sort be necessary, and how could we even possibly institute that sort of thing? Might be interesting for discussion. Anyways, have a good one.